When you hear the name Abraham, what comes to mind? For me, it's the father of nations, right? A true giant of faith. His story is just foundational for billions of people. But what if that story, that journey, was filled with moments of, well, very human weakness? Today, we're going to dig into a really fresh interpretation from one pastor who takes a super close look at Genesis and reveals a side of Abraham we almost never talk about.
So let's just start with this question. Was Abraham perfect? I mean, it almost feels wrong to ask, doesn't it? We're so used to seeing him as this flawless icon from the get-go. But this analysis, it really challenges that idea. It suggests that perfection wasn't where he started, it was where he was headed.
And check this out. This is the key verse. Think about the timing here. Abraham is 99 years old. 99. He's been walking with God for decades. And it's at this point that God comes to him and says, "Be you perfect." The source we're looking at argues that this pretty clearly implies he wasn't there yet. There was still a little bit of a journey left to go.
So what were these imperfections? Well, according to this pastor's reading of Genesis, if you look closely, you can find 7 distinct moments of weakness before Abraham finally reached that state of perfection. So let's break them down one by one.
First up, we're diving into a category that honestly might surprise you when you're thinking about the great patriarch. We're talking about an act of violence.
The very first weakness identified is about bloodshed. Now, his motive was absolutely noble. He was rescuing his nephew Lot from kidnappers. You can't argue with that. But this pastor's interpretation zooms in on the action itself. The fact that he led a raid and actually killed people is seen as a move away from that spiritual ideal he was supposed to represent.
And Scripture itself is pretty clear. This wasn't just defending himself. It was a planned military-style raid where he chased down and smoked his enemies. So even though his heart was in the right place, the act of violence itself is put on the list here as a weakness.
Okay, so that leads us into our next theme, which covers a whole bunch of weaknesses that are really rooted in personal fear and his relationships with his closest family.
All right, weakness number 2 is plain old fear. And this happened more than once. Abraham was so terrified that some foreign king would kill him to get to his beautiful wife Sarah that he lied. He claimed she was just his sister.
And you don't have to guess his reasoning. We have his own words right here. He's explaining his actions, saying he basically assumed the worst of these people. He thought, they don't fear God, so they'll have no problem killing me. And the pastor argues that this fear, in that moment, was bigger than his faith in God to protect him.
Third on the list, this one is a huge turning point in the whole story. Instead of just waiting on God's promise for a child, which, let's be honest, seemed impossible, Abraham listened to Sarah's more practical, human-level plan, and that choice is identified as a weakness.
You know, this moment is seen as just so critical. Sarah, she was just trying to help, right? She suggested he have a child with her handmaiden, Hagar, to fulfill the prophecy. By agreeing, Abraham took things into his own hands, and this interpretation sees that as a weakness of faith.
And, well, you know exactly what that led to. It takes us directly to weakness number 4, which is the action that came from listening to Sarah, Abraham sleeping with Hagar.
And this one action, which really came from a place of impatience and doubt, had massive, world-changing consequences. The pastor connects the birth of their son, Ishmael, to the origin of the Arab people and the centuries of conflict that came later with the descendants of Israel. It's framed as one moment of weakness that had these incredible historic repercussions.
Okay, for our final set of weaknesses, we're looking at moments where Abraham's judgment just kind of wavered, or his faith was put to the test, and in these specific instances, maybe didn't quite measure up.
Now this one is fascinating. Abraham is in the middle of this incredibly solemn covenant ceremony with God. God is literally passing through these sacrificed animals, and Abraham falls asleep, a deep sleep. This is seen not just as him being tired, but as a real spiritual lapse at a super critical moment. And according to the pastor's interpretation, this moment of weakness had a direct and really severe consequence. It was right after Abraham fell asleep that God told him his descendants would endure 400 years of slavery. The weakness and that difficult prophecy are presented as being directly connected.
The 6th weakness comes from something that seems like a good thing, like compassion, but it's framed here as disobedience. God's command was pretty clear: leave your country and your kindred, your relatives. But Abraham, out of attachment, brought his nephew Lot with him on the journey.
And guess what? This decision, which came from just not wanting to leave his family behind, led directly to conflict. Their herds got too big, their servants started fighting, and it all ended with Abraham having to force this really painful separation from the very person he chose to bring along.
And the final weakness, number 7, is maybe the most direct of them all. Just open, honest doubt. After everything God had promised him, after all the reassurances, Abraham still openly questioned the plan. He literally asked God, "What will you give me, seeing I go childless?"
I mean, listen to his words here. He's basically asking God, what good are all your blessings if I'm going to die without a child? He even suggests his servant is going to be his heir instead. It's just a raw moment of human doubt, questioning the absolute core of God's promise to him.
So now that we've walked through all 7 of these points, the pastor makes a really crucial distinction about the kind of language we should be using to talk about them.
The pastor really focuses on vocabulary, and he makes a very deliberate choice to use the word weakness. He actually advises against using these really charged terms like sin or fault or evil, because he argues we have to be careful with our words. It's really a call to describe Abraham's journey, not to condemn his mistakes.
You see, the ultimate goal here isn't to tear Abraham down. It's actually the complete opposite. By pointing out these struggles, this interpretation gives us a much more deeply human figure, someone who wrestled with fear and doubt, but kept walking with God, and ultimately grew into the patriarch of faith we know.
And that kind of leaves us with a final question to chew on. Does seeing the flaws in our heroes of faith, understanding that even Abraham had these weaknesses he had to overcome, does that actually make their stories more relatable to us? You know, maybe it makes their incredible faith feel just a little more accessible. And in the end, maybe even more inspiring.